But to start, I mean, there's no way around it. We have to talk about, this pandemic that we're living through, and particularly what that's meant for working people. Because there is certainly a lot of difficulty that we're all facing on the health side, but economically, people are suffering extremely right now. And I want to kick off by talking about this report that came out by Chuck Collins of the Institute for Policy Studies that found since March, billionaires' personal wealth in the United States has grown by $1 trillion as of November 24th. Mm-hmm. Which is an insane number. And then you consider what's happening for working people in this country. What's happening for working people in this country, not only have a lot of them seen their incomes be interrupted, you're also seeing this massive threat of evictions. And when it comes to the kind of programs that you would want a functioning government to provide for working people, we really haven't seen it. So the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government have been really effective, in my opinion, at looking out for the interests of the wealthy during this pandemic, while the response to the economic needs of working people has been, to put it lightly, inadequate. Do you all think that we can connect to the unequal pandemic response to how the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve respond to the 2008 crisis? And what would you like to see to sort of find a way to deal with the needs that most people are facing? And I'd like to kick it to Mark if you'd like to start this conversation off.
Okay, can you give me 1 second till I turn the lights on in my office?
Yeah, no problem.
And
I'll go
off, and I have to put back on. Bloody annoying technology that's meant to make your life better. You know that one?
Yeah.
Like, literally, I'm standing here pushing this and it wouldn't even go on.
They're trying to sabotage us.
Oh, thank you. Good man.
Let there be light.
My switches just on, off. No, I can't have that. Anyway. All right, let's get started. This is, let's just start with this. This is called the K-shaped recovery, right? So basically, if you're an asset holder, you're in the top 20% or above, basically two things happen. The link to 2008 is quantitative easing. The Fed basically buys shed loads of bonds. It buys shed loads of bonds to support liquidity in financial markets. That basically puts a floor under prices indirectly, and they did even more of that, particularly in March when the Treasury bills market seized up. The second part of it is when you come out in April and say, we'll buy everything, we'll buy ETFs. They don't actually end up buying them, but basically it's kind of a Jedi mind trick, right? It's a bit like Draghi in 2012, where he got it under control, so we have it under control. And effectively what that does is it says, I've just created a protected class of investments, and if you have them, don't worry, lads, I've got your back. Now, at that point in time, you've just told anyone who doesn't have rocks in their head, go buy those things. And if you go buy those things, they will go up in value. So that's the leg of the cake. Where is everybody else? Everybody else is on $1,200 checks. Now, why in a world where everybody is one of these are you sending people checks? And the answer is because you don't really want the money to go there. Right? That's the congressional politics of it. At the end of the day, bailing people out is difficult. Bailing corporations out, particularly when they've hollowed themselves out with buybacks, is actually quite easy. Now, the second thing is, and this is where I'm much more sympathetic to the Fed than Congress, the Fed's pipes for money run one way, right? They basically take the reserves and stick them in 25 banks, and then they're meant to go out to the rest of the economy. They have neither the capacity nor the political mandate to direct those pipes to Main Street. So the Main Street lending program that went through the Small Business Association, total disaster. Imagine putting a fire hose this big into a tap this big, right? That's basically what happened with this program. So you have a massive skew of not just attention and political will, literally the financial plumbing of the country goes this way through the banking system to Wall Street and out. It simply doesn't go this way. Now, the Fed, if you look at their own research, are completely aware of the inequality effects of quantitative easing, of what's happening to household income in the pandemic, the whole lot. And a great many of them think people that have been there, like Claudia Sam, people who are still there, like Bernard, who really want to do something more than this. But they're technocrats. That's not their job. That's not fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is held hostage by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party love deficits when they're in power so they can enrich their own constituents, and then punish Democrats for being 1 cent out Micawber-wise the minute they're in power, which is what we're seeing again. So in a sense, there's a link to 2008. It's quantitative easing. It was replicated again in this pandemic. there's a massive asymmetry to the protections afforded American corporations versus the American people. When you create a class of protected securities, you basically guarantee a stock market boom regardless of the real state of the real economy. And as usual, wage earners in the United States get stuffed because it's their fault they're unemployed. And that's what they get told. And even in this case, when it clearly isn't, that narrative is still there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Richard Wolff, how would you categorize, this response so far from both of these institutions, the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government, to the COVID crisis?
Well, I want to thank Mark. I don't have to go over all of that stuff again. Hear that. I noticed that Mary Daly, the Fed governor from San Francisco, gave a speech the other day in which she went pretty far compared to her fellow governors in admitting the inequality boosting dimension of everything that they've done, and pretty much admitting that they were in such a rush to prevent complete chaos that they just didn't care. It's exactly the way Mark described it, but they knew exactly what they were doing and what that would mean and where that would go. For her to say now, afterwards, gee, that was, okay, it's better than nothing. But that's really all you can say, given what they've done. So let me jump to a huge historical hypothesis, if I can. And I know I'm going out on a limb, but I'm among friends, so I can do it. I think this is such a massive breakdown and failure of capitalism that for the first time in my life, and I mean that, the decline and the disappearance are actually in my head, not as a wild fantasy, wishful thinking, but as something which, still a low probability, is not what it was. And let me explain. We have capitalist enterprises in this country that can produce masks and gloves and ventilators and hospitals. We can do all of that. We have the raw materials. We have the equipment. We have the labor power. We have everything. We didn't do it. It wasn't done. We still now, 9 months later, don't have adequate supplies of most of these crucial items. And I include tests and all the rest of it. So it seems to me a stark sentence is now utterable. The leaving things to the private capitalist sector, the profit motive, whatever you want to call it, does not produce that which we know we need to confront a known threat. Viruses have been with the human race from day one. We had a horrific one in 1918 that everybody who studies this stuff has to learn about, the so-called Spanish flu. Much more recently, we've had MERS, SARS, Ebola, and all the rest. There is no excuse. Everybody knows this can happen, and then you need these things to control infection. The private capitalist sector didn't do it. And they didn't do it for reasons that are baked into capitalism. It's too expensive. Who's going to make a mask, millions of them, store them and stockpile them in warehouses around the country, monitor them, secure them, clean them, replace them, and then for how long? Who knows, until the next virus comes. The risk, the reward, it all says to capitalists to do what they did, namely invest in something else, not make these things. So yeah. I can now say publicly, wherever I go, capitalism, the logic and how it works, and protecting the public health don't work together. They're
and if I could just like interject to reinforce that, I think that everything you said about the masks and the PPE and ventilators and all that is absolutely true. But we can also talk about the vaccine. Like after MERS and SARS, which were both near misses for exactly what's happening right now. There could have been massive research put into to finding coronavirus vaccines. Both of those are coronaviruses, and this is not just Monday night, quarterbacking. There are lots of papers you can read by scientists, for years back, warning we really need to research this stuff. Look at what almost happened in both of these cases. We really need to be looking into this, but the pharmaceutical companies don't have an incentive to do that. And I think it's really telling to compare the incentives the pharmaceutical companies have with a publicly run institution, obviously not an institution I'm a fan of, but, the imperialist U.S. military. But because it's publicly run, when they fund it, they can fund it in ways that have all kinds of unlikely scenarios in mind. Okay, what if there's a war here? What if this kind of thing happens? What if 2 wars break out in different parts of the world? And, we need to be ready for that. Whereas the pharmaceutical companies have to think about the next quarterly profit projection. So they think, they think purely in terms of what are we going to sell next year, not what should we be doing to research, prepare for things that might be coming down the pipe in 5 years or 10 years.
Ben, the military is what I do. It's wonderful that you're thinking like this, and we really are on the same wavelength, because as soon as I finish explaining why private capitalism failed to deal with public health, no minor matter for it to have failed on, then I use the military as an example. I say to the people, well, of course, the government could have come in. The government could have come in and bought masks as fast as they came off the assembly line, and ventilators and hospital and all the rest of it. And then at government expense, stored them, stockpile them, monitor them, do all of that. And then I say, we know the government could have done it, because that's what the government does with the military. It's also unprofitable to make a missile and stick it in a warehouse waiting for the next war. It's too risky. And nobody would do it. They wouldn't build a tank or a missile or a jet plane or any of that crap. And so the government comes in and does exactly that. It buys it as fast as it comes off, pays a hefty price, guarantees the cost plus contract profit, and so you could have done for public health what you do, in fact, for the military, for the exact, except the 4 industries that dominate health in this country, doctors, hospitals, drug and device makers, and the insurers, they have a monopoly. I mean, they've worked out a deal to hold hostage this whole country, and the last thing they want is the government to come in, even if it would solve the problem, because it would lay open the Medicare for All option that is in the back of everyone's.
But behind that, there's another one, which is government doesn't think that way. And I'll give you the proof, right? So the proof is 2008. So the pandemic's totally different from 2008. No, they're not. They're both macroeconomic shocks. You know that you're going to get them. In 2008, we had the once-in-a-lifetime one, and we'd learned our lessons, and we'd de-risked the banks and all this sort of stuff. But we singularly didn't do a damn thing about economic preparedness for another major economic shock, right? There was zero learning. Even the austerity debacle in Europe, which defenestrated the whole of Southern Europe. The IMF learned internally from its documents, but in terms of its actual policy, maybe that much. What are we doing now? We're going to do exactly the same thing again, despite the fact that every country in the OECD can issue 15-year debt at negative real yield, which means the investor is paying you to take the bill and you pay back less 15 years from now than you do at present. You've got them starting again. Oh, we have to tighten our belts. Look at that pile of debt. The national credit card is maxed out and all the rest of the horseshit that they come out periodically. So it's not only that they don't learn or don't think that way, they're incentivized to keep this whole shenanigans going in as well. And at the end of the day, what does it lead to? It leads in fragility in health, fragility in the economy, and fragility in people's lives. And how do people respond to that fragility? They get stressed, and they get pissed, and they get angry. And that's what's driving our politics. It's all linked.
That's right. Absolutely. Here's my other big thought, and then I'll stop. The 13th century, 14th and 13th, 14th century, we had the Black Death. We had this situation in which a certain level of exhaustion under feudalism, soil exhaustion and so forth, combined to weaken a population, make them vulnerable. They had the Black Death, the rats, the lice, and all the rest. And a third of Europe, if my numbers are correct, is dies. And I don't think feudalism ever recovered. I mean, you can pretty quickly see whether it's the Renaissance or the Reformation or all of the rest, it's downhill. They could not recover, and rightly so. A system so deficient that it would do that or allow or enable that is a system that consciously or unconsciously is going to be rejected by people in a way and with a self-confidence that they may not have had before being forced to go through such a catastrophe. I'm wondering, and of course we will all be long dead, but I'm wondering if we could hypothetically imagine looking back a century or so from now at this moment and saying to ourselves, this level, particularly in the United States, which as the leading capitalist country is quite the place for this to happen, that if it happens in the richest or one of the richest countries, they have to lose 500,000 people, which is what I understand the prediction now is minimum. Lose 500,000 people, have 50 million sick with this thing, suffer the economic catastrophe. You know, I know that half the people in school in this country are not getting an education because of all the fake distance learning crap that I'm unfortunately participating in, but I have no illusions about. The cost to this society is going to be massive beyond what it already is, and it'll stand as an irrefutable critique of what this system failed to avoid.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, like a metaphor that I think about sometimes, you know, because of course, you know, you can say, look, capitalism, you know, didn't cause the virus. Okay, sure. But, you know, if you have a sweatshop where there's like flammable material left out all over the place and the doors are locked, you know, from the outside so workers can't leave during their shifts, and there's a lightning strike, and then, you know, because of the conditions, there's a fire that spreads throughout the entire place and everybody dies. Yeah, the factory owners didn't didn't cause the lightning strike, but it's still their fault what happened. And, you know, a metaphor that I've heard bandied about, or I heard, I think in the spring, you know, started to be bandied about, kind of along the lines of Professor Wolff's point about the Black Death and feudalism, is people saying, you know, this is like the Chernobyl of American capitalism, which the first time you hear it, it sounds like, oh, that's hyperbolic. But you think, no, it's not. It's the opposite, because the death toll from Chernobyl wasn't even a drop in the bucket compared to the death toll of COVID. It was like a fraction of a drop. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge like indictment of the system that it's played out in this way.
And also, so we have about 5 minutes left before we move on to the next one. I also just want to get your thoughts on this too, Ben, because I know you got in trouble for, you know, writing some pieces about, you know, the reopen protests. But, you know, in my opinion, if you don't provide people money, if you don't provide them support, and you tell especially low-wage workers that they have to stay home, you know, you set yourself up for it. Now, being fair, you know, a lot of the people who are running those kind of protests aren't, you know, working people necessarily, or those like, you know, business owners and folks like that. But there is a large contingent of Americans who they don't see any real option. They're not choosing to ignore the virus. There are a lot of people who are saying, I don't have a choice because I have to go into work or else I won't be able to provide for myself.
Yeah, no, that's right. So the context of this was pretty early on in the pandemic, like late spring, early summer. It all blurs together. In my home state of Michigan, there were these protests at the state capitol by people who were opposed to the COVID lockdowns, and you know, and of course, you know, the people who were running the show were, you know, horrifying right wingers. You know, there were like Proud Boys who were blocking. Like, there's a picture of a doctor in a white coat going out to plead with, you know, one of the leaders to stop blocking the intersection in front of Sparrow Hospital. You know, stopping people from getting in and out, which is the hospital where both of my siblings were born. So, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, I can't stand these people. But the point I was making in that article for Jacobin, you know, the left can't simply dismiss the anti-lockdown protests, is not that these weren't, horrible right-wing ghouls. They obviously were, and it's not that I, share their goals. Of course, I don't. I think we absolutely do need lockdowns. My position since the pandemic started, and still now, is that we should shut down everything that can reasonably be shut down, and send everybody a couple $1,000s a month, until it's all over. That just seems obvious. But the problem is, what was pointed out in the article is that we, back then, now it's considerably eased up, even though the pandemic's actually getting worse. But at that point, we were doing the first half of that program, but we weren't doing the second half. We weren't providing people with meaningful economic support. And so the worry that I raised in the article, and I quoted people, I said, even people who are members of, thuggish right-wing organizations seem to be partially motivated by these kinds of concerns, making, like rent payments, making, car payments, all of these things that they can't do if they can't go to work and earn a living, and, a couple of $1,200 checks is not going to get it done. And so the worry, Twitter being what it is, a lot of people reacted to the headline without reading it or, quote mined it. Not just random Twitter trolls like Matt Iglesias, reacted to it this way. But the point of the article was, if we want this to stay marginal, right, which at that time it was, if we want this to stay marginal, that we don't want this movement against these necessary public health lockdowns to gain support, we need to start providing people with meaningful economic assistance so they can afford to stay home. And that's really what our eyes should be on in all of this.